Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this symposium, which is titled Building a Planetary Solution, Regenerative Biomaterial Strategies for a Planet in Crisis. This symposium has been convened by Senior Critic and Director of the Building Lab program here at the School of Architecture, Alan Organsky. Hi, Alan. Longtime faculty member, yes. He's running out of the room as I'm about to say nice things about him. Longtime faculty member, gifted practitioner, good friend. I really want to thank him for all of the effort he has put into planning this important and ambitious event. He's going to be describing in some detail what's going to happen today and tomorrow in his introduction, which is going to follow mine. So I won't say more on that other than to thank you for coming to Yale on a cold Friday morning to join in this conversation and exchange of ideas. However, I am going to describe one thing briefly, which is how fortunate we are here at the School of Architecture to be able to host symposia like this one. This is supported by the J. Irwin Miller Endowment. Now, J. Irwin Miller was the legendary head of Cummins, a leading engineering and manufacturing firm based in Indiana. Started as a family business in the 19th century, Miller led Cummins for most of the mid to late 20th century. He was a man very much ahead of his time. I don't think, are these meant to be just rolling? Oh, good. All right, good. Back to Cummins. Miller was a man quite a bit ahead of his time. He was a great philanthropist, a visionary in terms of diversity in hiring, and a leader in supporting education. He graduated from Yale College in 1931 and was later a member of the Yale Corporation. However, to architects, and I think there are a good number of architects in the room, he may be most noteworthy for funding the world-renowned program in Columbus, Indiana, that supported and continues to support the hiring of world-class architects for the design of public buildings. He believed in the positive power and impact of good architecture. If you haven't been to Columbus, Indiana, I suggest you take a trip there. Both Miller and his wife lived very, very long lives, well into their late 90s, and at their deaths, their children gave the house, which was designed by Eero Saarinen, to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. They also endowed the fund which pays for this symposium and all the other symposia we do here at the School of Architecture, along with many other generous gifts to Yale University and to the school. We thank the Miller children, Will Miller, who got his BA in 78, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret Miller, who got her MA in 68. I think Aaron Schiller is here. You here, Aaron? Anyway, one of the Miller grandchildren is an architect trained here at the school. He's going to join us later today. I know the Millers in general, with their generosity and their global vision and their commitment to a more just and sustainable world, would much appreciate the subject of this symposium, Alan. They follow their father's lead in a commitment to good design, and that what we build and how we build says everything about who we are and what the world is that we want to see. That's really the subject of this symposium. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Alan now.
Thank you, Deborah, for that extremely kind introduction, and thank you to the Miller family. I will say that this has been a collaboration among a lot of people. So I'll save the thanks for the end, so you don't have to listen to me talk too much now. But really, without this huge array of panelists and without the incredible help of the staff at the school, this would not have happened. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, that it goes very, very smoothly. We'll look forward to your feedback. I want to talk maybe with a slightly pessimistic look at the challenges we currently face with the global climate crisis and all the associated sets of impacts and depredations that have occurred. And I'd like to talk specifically about our world, which is the urban building sector, or the building sector more broadly, globally. And this is a shot from above, obviously, of Tokyo, which happens to be the largest megalopolis in the world, hosting 39 million people. But industrial ecologists will tell you that it's also the largest stockpile of human-made material in the world, the most concentrated, largest stockpile. And in those studies, we come to understand that with that awareness of this huge capacity of the human technosphere come a set of impacts. And those impacts are broad, far-ranging. They don't happen just around the environs and hinterlands of Tokyo. They spread across the world because of the many benefits, but also impacts of global economies. And so I could list these for you. They're all familiar to you, but they are associated with the making of cities. And so in thinking about that, we not only need to think about the past impacts that we've had in making cities and buildings and human settlement more generally, but also to try to understand what we're looking toward in the next 25 years. So IPCC tells us 2.5 roughly billion people will be inhabiting cities in the coming 25 years, which entails a land use or land conversion of 3 times what are currently covered by conurbation, or another way to think of it is in square meters, almost 150,000 square meters of building, which is, or square kilometers of building, excuse me. I like not to be hyperbolic, but I see that we need hyperbole here. Which for Americans, that's like covering the entire state of New York with a building. Not a city, a building. Or for the Europeans, 2 Irelands, for Asians here, 4 Bhutans. Covered entirely in building, a mat of building. Which is great news for the construction sector, because if they do it right, that's a $97 trillion benefit to them, boom. Building boom, which the Ellen MacArthur Foundation tells us. But we also know that the building sector, in its consumption of energy and emissions of greenhouse gases, produces nearly 50%. I think 42% is the current estimate. I think a lot of my colleagues in this field say it's a lot greater if we expand our system boundaries. So imagine, okay, let's say 40%, nearly 50% of greenhouse gas emissions comes out of the activities and artifacts of the building sector. And we'll get to this other thing, which is that by 2050, half of those will be associated with the consumption, production of material, and it's spreading across the planet. That's 71 gigatons of emissions, which blows us through every single possible guardrail that we can imagine, pushes the edges, and punctures through the boundaries of planetary resource capacity. And I just want to note that the last time we were at 420 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, which is well above the 350 sustainable threshold, we actually had a global temperature that was increased from today by 5 degrees Celsius. So in some senses, as architects, we like to think that we talk a lot about material. And there's an inclination here that we're going to talk about biomaterial, timber. And I think that's because we see that as one solution. But I don't want to talk about the architecture of wood, although you can see from this crosscut of an ash tree that the sorts of flaws and checks and knots that are there explain why wood has been largely discarded until only very recently as a means to build urban centers. And we're an architecture school at Yale, but we're not really going to talk about buildings particularly, or this thing called mass timber now, which is most people think is just CLT, cross-laminated timber, but it's a lot of other things. We're not going to talk about the materiality and the materialization of buildings using those so much. The architecture that we want to talk about today is the architecture of this system, bounded here in this diagram within the bounds of the life cycle of a building, but which I hope will show extend far beyond the material impacts and the operational energy impacts of building. And I'll get to that a little more. Really what we're talking about is putatively natural systems, the systems that have been so thoroughly globally disturbed by human activity that it's hard to call them natural anymore. And its relationship to another land use, urban building and infrastructure. And these are two landscapes that have been historically antagonistic. I should say one is predatory and the other is prey. the city consumes the natural systems in different ways. And because of that consumption of material and the drawing upon those resources globally, we've created this giant hole in the planet. I use that obviously metaphorically, but also literally, that these processes of consumption, often remote well beyond what we can see or feel or experience, are actually starting to create overt burdens that will be unsustainable, despite our goals over 20 years to be sustainable. Oh, and this chestnut from the Architecture 2030, that, as I mentioned before, nearly half of all of the emissions that we experience in the next 25 years won't because we're burning too much energy for heating and cooling our buildings, but because we'll be building the buildings, and all of the energies and impacts that go into that will represent half of all anthropogenic building-related impacts. And so to break that down really quickly, half of the half, roughly 23%, is associated with that production phase, or so-called embodied phase of building: raw material extraction, material handling, transport, the processing and manufacture of different products. Construction and maintenance of buildings over the building life cycle will entail exchanges of material and human power. And then finally, at the end of the life, which we've thought very little about, we demolish buildings, we often landfill them, and we create a new, almost anthropogenic mat of a new geological stratum across the planet. And so this boundary, which I said before, of the building life cycle, is thought in kind of conventional ways, I think, that are troubling if you're really trying to understand these broad, far-reaching impacts of building. It looks like this. You got this big bar on one side, which is operational emissions, and then you've got a bunch of little smaller bars that look less important. And even if you stack them, they only represent about half, let's say, of this operational emissions that you see in this bar graph. But if we add a really simple axis, which is time, we start to understand where our agency lies as participants in the activities and artifact building of the building sector. There's a little spike. Seems little. Right at the beginning of the building life cycle, in the first year of life, as we create this building and move things into the construction site and build. And then the lights go on and people move in, and we have a little, maybe 10, 15 years in, we have a little pulse, which is based on the maintenance requirements of the building. And then 15 more years go by and we do some repairs, and that creates another little pulse of carbon emissions. And then again, retrofit when the building doesn't seem to work for us anymore. And then finally at the end, we give up and we tear it down, and we call this the end of life. This is the so-called embodied emissions that we've all been talking about, or embodied carbon, right? The impacts that come from all the processes that aren't even about occupying a building. But let's look at this operational carbon. The minute the door opens in this building after it's been renovated or rebuilt, we start emitting carbon through the consumption of energy to make the building safe, lit, warm, cool, whatever is required. And very slowly, that use of energy, consumption of energy, produces emissions over time. And it grows. And you can see about 25 years out, it crosses over the line of embodied emissions, embodied carbon. And that's significant if you think about the fact that in 25 years we'll have 2.5 billion people inhabiting planets. And so what we really focused on in the building sector, because we want to be sustainable and we have the right ideas in our hearts and minds, is to make buildings operationally efficient, adding lots of material layers, creating a lot of complexity in mechanical systems to produce high efficiency buildings, or in the case of passive house construction, super efficient buildings. And it's important to note, as I said, that we don't pay off that embodied debt for 25 years if we're just making buildings and business as usual approaches. And if we're super efficient in our buildings, making even passive house construction, we never ever pay off that debt, or at least in within the range of climate action that we have. And so that's a really important thing to remember, that if we want to act now, we have to think really hard about how we consume materials and how we specify products in our buildings. And I would say even further, we can really expand beyond what what lifecycle assessment allows us to consider, which is what happened to those ecosystems from which we dragged resources? How are they doing? And what's going to happen at the end of life to these buildings? Are they going to be landfilled? Could we actually not only design for disassembly, but design for scenarios of reuse of all the materials we put into buildings? This is a huge burden for architects and engineers and builders, but it's something I think we inevitably must face. Let me give you one more graph. This is a graph of the weight in teratons of mass on the surface of the Earth. Biomass has been pretty steady. Despite population growth, the biomass on the Earth sits at about a little under 1.2 teratons of weight in the planet. The stuff we make has, in this red letter year, the products of the technosphere have now exceeded the weight of biomass in 2020. And so essentially what we're doing is we're loading the Earth. Not only are we extracting, but we're also burdening the planet. And I think that's really two important ways to think about it. The materials, obviously, are all the materials we use to make buildings. A mentor of ours, Tom Gradle, a father of industrial ecology, used to hold up his cell phone for audiences in his classes and say, every element in the periodic table, except the radioactive ones, although we don't know what Apple has in mind, is in this phone. And so imagine a building as a huge phone that has enormous amounts of material, an array of elements that we're not even sure how to discern and separate for reuse, which will be an important topic of today's conversation. And lastly, you're all really familiar with this graph. We've surpassed our 1.5 degree, only a couple of months ago, 1.5 degree Celsius guardrail. And that was supposed to happen in the 2030s. And the 2 degree guardrail is coming up quickly. And if we keep going, we're going to have this business as usual scenario. The planet will truly be uninhabitable in the next 50 to 100 years, or at least maybe not for the wealthiest of us, but certainly for the most disenfranchised populations, not to mention all the species who inhabit the planet with us. And if we proceed with the broad sectoral decarbonization strategies that have been identified by some of the leading thinkers in the planet, we're going to kind of level out in the best case above 2 degrees. And so the question is it possible, given all the material we specify, is it possible that we could specify materials that would actually create a reduction of that and a return to a more stable, over a century, but return to a more stable and sustainable global temperature? These are questions. One thing that we've talked about a lot, and I've studied with colleagues in the audience, is this idea that using timber in a synergy with forests could actually make cities carbon sinks, which is, immediately once it was written in a report, it was attacked by different people or lauded by other people. And, I'm proud of the fact that it drew attention, and my co-authors were, an array of interdisciplinary writers. And what we showed was that essentially you could build cities with these new engineering materials, mass timber, engineered timber, things like that, and it would have potentially the effect of creating a giant carbon bank of photosynthetic carbon drawn sustainably out of the forests, put into buildings and stored there for the lifetime of the building and beyond. And you can see here from this that if we just think about carbon emissions by weight, concrete and timber look pretty good, but wood has an incredibly high strength to weight ratio, so it actually exceeds by far the sets of impacts for the return. And then if you add carbon storage capacity, there's a little bit in concrete as it mineralizes and surface mineralizes, but there's a lot in biogenic materials like wood. There's an enormous possibility here if we can somehow manage our relationship with forests. But forests are already being managed in a sense, or mismanaged, through our activities or lack of activities in taking care of them and understanding their ecosystems. And we're very familiar most recently with smoke-filled skies that are 1,000 miles away from these massive wildfires that are occurring in Ontario and Canada and the Pacific Northwest, Australia, not to mention Canary Islands. But there are a lot of forces at work in forest conversion that are changing forests. And yes, it is true that the use of forest products, it represents a percentage, 15 to 20, depending on who's counting, of land conversions associated with forests. But there are others. Climate change, as we just saw. Agricultural conversions is a big one that we all know about. When we eat our hamburgers, we are deforesting. Mining and mineral extraction. We cut down forests to get to minerals that we use for cell phones and steel making and things like that. And then finally, just making cities and suburbs are causing land conversion. And along with that come enormous social inequities. We talk about building housing, but in fact, we fail to meet the housing demands of the most disenfranchised populations in the world. And that creates disparities of resource access and just livelihood and living standards that will become increasingly intolerable. They are already intolerable. And we've identified the different distribution of wealth and resource scarcity across the planet. That's been fairly well documented, and we have what's called the Global South, which is represented by certain sets of countries with very little income access, very little quality of living standards. And we talk a lot about our focus of the Global South, which is apt and necessary, extremely important. But I just want to remind everybody, and my students and Adam's students in the Yale Building Project working with the communities to build housing know this very well. Little pockets of the so-called Global South exist littered throughout North America. And we can't forget those communities too, especially at this political moment. We're running out of stuff, like silly stuff that you would never think you could run out of. Sharp sand. We consume 40 gigatons of sharp sand from dredging. It's spawned criminal syndicates. Who would think that a criminal dredging syndicate could exist across the planet? And yet it's creating enormous impacts to mangrove stands, et cetera. Then at the end, we dump a lot of waste onto the planet. And we create this anthropogenic stratum of a new geological era. And I'll note that we have many ways of creating waste in buildings. One is by construction. 30% of wood that goes into a construction site goes out in a dumpster before the building is occupied, which seems wasteful, to say the least. And then we have really, really new geopolitical ways of creating waste by, say, destroying a city like Kharkiv. And this all comes down to a kind of economic extractivism, which I'm afraid I and most of us here have been party to, which is that we assume these resources are available to us. We studiously ignore the externalities and the effects that happen outside of our cone of vision. And there are many forms of extractivism, and there are many results of extractivism, which we'll also get to talk about today. So the question is, could we create a synergistic relationship between the science of biological systems, such as forests, that are obviously metabolic, circular, and regenerative when allowed to function well and when helped to function well, and a new way of building out this gigantic, massive building that we're going to create in the next 25 years, to not only try to reduce our impact and mitigate climate change by being a little better, but rather say that the building is an agent to restore global landscapes. And that synergy will take a lot of work. It'll happen in places like the School of Architecture at Yale and others, the people that we collaborate with, to really understand the systemic development of forest stands, their successions, how they work, what kinds of biodiversity are created at each stage of growth, of regrowth of a forest, how we move products through that, and how we store and track carbon along that way, and studiously and transparently assess that, how we apply them to different building components. This is the stuff that engineers and architects think about all the time, but if they thought about it with a much broader realm of thought and expanded system boundaries, we would be better off, I think. And then finally, embracing density, reducing the amount of land we use, sharing materials, all of the things that come along with really thoughtful human occupation of the land. And so that's the question for today. System change? Can we do it? What I would like to do is ask our speakers today, and there's an incredible array of people to help us answer this question, to address that. And to address it, unfortunately, at a moment when a bias against science, or I would even say an ideology that is antagonistic to science, has now taken hold in parts of the world, especially in the most powerful nations. and now has been reified in the government of the United States. And so with that framework, I hope that we can address today ways that our own agency can produce profound benefits in a crisis that is political, social, economic, and environmental. We have an incredible array of speakers to help us with that today, and I want to thank them all for making trips from far and wide and also near. And with that, I want to introduce our first panel. Anna Dyson will be moderating the first panel, which is entitled Terrestrial Challenge, Barriers and Benefits to System Change. Anna's a close colleague of mine. We've worked on a lot of projects together. We've stormed the gates of the UN together to build a building that tries to demonstrate some of the principles that we think will help. And Anna's the Heinz Professor of Architecture, pushing advanced research at the school here and at the School of the Environment. And I'm really, really proud to have her open this presentation. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alan, for this incredible opening provocation. This is an incredible panel that Alan has put together, and I have to say that if we work really, really hard this morning, I think we have a chance to connect a few dots that are not usually connected. He has set it up so that we will start literally as at the planet scale with the work of the geobiosphere. And if we can consider these epic time and length scales in association with our kind of micro decisions that we make as built environment professionals and researchers, we will follow basically a series of guests, starting with Karen Cito, who will be leading us in sort of re-lensing the global aggregated statistics and global trends across many interrelated fields of decision-making and in relationship to the built environment. Carrying us through the discussion will be my close colleague and collaborator, Barbara Reck, who will be connecting these global statistics and all the way down to the material flows as they start to flow towards, many of us in this room are recipient specifiers in our work of materials. We also have a lot of people who are developing materials and new methods. And it's incumbent upon us to really zoom out in the way that I love the analogy that Alan just made to the cell phone, because ultimately, if we're looking at circularity, we have to look through many different lenses in terms of the interrelationship across elements and across materials. And Barbara will be showing a synthetic diagram, a very provocative diagram that we ended our global material, our UN global report, Building Materials in the Climate, on, that caused a lot of controversy because it was advocating the type of shift that Alan is describing, a type of new circular material economy and a regenerative economy that would require new models of cooperation and innovation between the agricultural, forestry, and built environment sectors. But we're going to talk about the messy controversies as we are actually making the decisions and the trade-off decision-making, which is bringing us also to Phil Bernstein's presentation, which encourages us to actually put human beings back into the living ecosystem in our accounting, which is not always happening. There are very interesting correlationships between the way that we treat the environment and the way that we treat our fellow human beings in the production of built environment systems and materials. And we will then end with where we often find ourselves in this room, which is boots on the ground, the decisions that we make in putting up buildings. And Phil Miswitz will take us through some incredible projects, very, very thought-provoking projects that are architectural designs and systems that are encouraging a completely different new material paradigm. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. But before I do, I think given the current political climate, it's really important that we acknowledge a few microhistories that in our recent past, as uncomfortable as they may be, and the ones that we're making right now. I'm a graduate of the school, and I remember a very recent time when we had to go all the way to the School of Forestry if we wanted to study anything related to the environment. It's actually just a mere decade ago when it was not only unfashionable to think about architects as being responsible for climate change or having a role in that, it was downright socially impermissible in many cases and unacceptable to even bring it up. We had leadership that said that this school of architecture that's not what we do. When asked if we would engage in a project called Planetary Solutions that was being incubated at the highest leadership of the school, of the university, that is. And Alan Organsky is one person who, long before it was fashionable here or cool, was inspiring many, many people to understand our work and the importance of earnestly earnestly responsible for climate change in our actions and for anything to do with ecology and regeneration. He inspired people far away from the school and the boundaries of the school as well. I was very aware of his work, and we were very inspired to come to Yale because of Alan and others. And also it's important to say in this current climate, because it's amazing to think that we might actually come into a time where it will be impossible to hold these types of events, because we require funding and we require leadership to prioritize these events. So to be able to have this incredible symposium that Alan's put together and linked to the one that Phil Bernstein will be putting together on labor in April, it actually requires leadership that cares about expanding the parameters of architecture into other and very, very important and essential questions of our time. So with that, a lot of people don't realize that our first speaker is, in addition to being an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, is a member of our faculty at the School of Architecture. So Karen Sito, many of us know her as one of the most supportive and collaborative faculty members on the campus, but she's known as the Frederick C. Hickson Professor of Geography and Urbanization Sciences at the Yale School of the Environment, where she has a primary appointment. She's the co-director of the Yale Center for Geospatial Solutions and the director of the Hickson Center for Urban Sustainability at Yale University. So please join me in welcoming a Yale and national treasure, Karen Sito.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Alan, for inviting me to join in this really important conversation. I'm going to start with the end. I'm going to start with my 3 key messages and then work backwards. The first message you've already heard from Alan, which is that if we are to solve climate change, it depends very much on how you design, construct, and operate future cities. That's critical. The second key point, though, is we need to do this urgently, and we need to do it at scale. So those are my 3 key messages. Let me start with a very, very big picture. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was established in 1988 by the UN General Assembly, and its mandate is to assess the current science on climate change in order to inform policy at international levels. It is the IPCC reports that help set negotiations and agreements at the international level. And they're considered to be the most comprehensive and reliable source of information on climate change. And since the IPCC was formed it has generated 6 assessment reports. I've been involved in the last 2 assessment reports. The last one was published in 2021, and this is one of the visuals from the 2021 report. And in that report, we concluded that human-induced warming had reached about 1 degree C above pre-industrial levels as of 2017. Now, Alan's already given away my punchline, but I'll keep going, though. And in that report, which was just published a few years ago, we also said that if current warming continues, we're going to reach 1.5 degrees C around 2040. And why do we scientists and policymakers focus on 1.5 degrees C? It's largely because even small increases in temperature beyond this threshold can really significantly exacerbate the risks and impacts of climate change. So everything from extreme heat to fisheries loss. So the critical point here is that we have focused on 1.5 degrees C because we know that going beyond 1.5 degrees C will have a really big impact. But again, as Alan mentioned, just last year, we have data from 5 different sources that confirm that we have already exceeded 1.5 degrees C. So I want to really emphasize here that even 0.5 degree of additional warming will have substantial differences in climate change impacts. And the numbers that you see here are the differences between warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. So we're going to see 400 million more people exposed to water shortages in a 2 degree C world versus a 1.5 degree C world. So that's 400 million more. A decline in fisheries will 2 times be worse than a 1.5 degree C world. In terms of extreme precipitation and flooding, we're going to see an increase of over 170%. Again, that's the difference between a world of 1.5 degrees, which we've already crossed, and 2 degrees. So we've already exceeded 1.5 degrees C, above the pre-industrial average. And the question before us is, how do we limit further warming? And if we look at the various climate scenarios, you see there are very large variations of the future, of future emissions and warming. But in order to understand what might happen in the future, we really have to have a good understanding of the main drivers of emissions today. And that gives us an indication of how we might limit global warming in the future. Now, I should say that for the first 4 IPCC reports, the focus was on the energy transition. And cities were barely mentioned. They were mentioned through chapters on land, on energy, on transport, on buildings, but the lens was through sectors. It was not through cities. And it wasn't until the 5th assessment report that the IPCC started looking at cities as a way to mitigate emissions. So what we have learned from these IPCC reports is that existing cities use about 78% of the world's energy. That's not the same thing as CO2 emissions. We see that existing cities account for somewhere between 2/3 to 75% of global carbon emissions. But you see that there's a very large range in per capita carbon emissions. So in developed countries, which constitute less than 1/4 of total urban population globally, in developed countries, we generate about twice as much carbon emissions per capita as the average person in Asia and the Pacific, and about 5 times as much as the average person in Africa. Now, I want you to keep the shape of this graph in mind, because I'm going to come back to a very similar shape in just a couple of slides. But the key point here is that there are very large variations in per capita emissions, and this is very tied to our built environment. But if we look in the future, we know that population is going to increase, or the urban population is going to increase somewhere between 2 to 2.5 billion out to 2050. Now, During COVID, one of the most common questions I was asked by policymakers was, will urbanization continue? Will these numbers stand? And the thing that I would repeatedly say to policymakers is, yes, people are moving to smaller cities, but they're not going back into the, farming. Maybe they are weekend farmers, but people are still moving into cities, maybe smaller cities. So this is still a major trend. This translates to about 1.3 million people moving into cities every single week. It translates to building urban areas equivalent to 20,000 American football fields every single day. So the scale of this transition is really enormous. And so, again, one of the first key messages of this is that how we build future cities and their infrastructure, and again, I really want to emphasize at scale, will shape emissions. And here what you see on this slide are 4 different scenarios of future urban emissions that depend on how you design, build, and operate these future cities. And these 4 different scenarios, and what you see on the y-axis is carbon emissions, total carbon emissions total carbon emissions per year. And you can see that in very different scenarios, we can either have peak emissions sometime in the middle of this century, or in the bottom 2 scenarios, we see carbon emissions continue to rise even at the end of this century. So if we look at how emissions are distributed across the built environment, we see that there's huge differences between the global north and global south. Annex 1 countries, which are essentially global north countries, have on average twice as much per capita infrastructure as the global average. But 2 to 2.5 billion more urban dwellers are primarily going to be in the global south. And so just by building new urban infrastructure and upgrading existing infrastructure, it could generate 4 times more CO2 emissions than was used to even build the existing infrastructure. So this purple area is really critical. This basically determines how future emissions and future warming scenarios. But I want to really emphasize that it's not just more people in cities. It's also massive demographic and household changes associated with urbanization. We see that all around the world, there's declining average household size. Here are data from many different countries around the world, and on the y-axis you see average household size. You see declining household size all around the world. In the Americas, we observe an average decrease of approximately 1 person per household every 2 decades. In Europe, it's a little bit less. It's a decrease of about 1 person per household every 5 decades. So we have more urban population, but smaller household size. And not surprisingly, with smaller household size, we see this rise of single-person households. And the top row, we see it's data with households headed by persons that are younger than 50 years old, and the bottom row are households headed by persons over or at 50 years and older. So it's not surprising that with populations aging, we're going to see a higher proportion of older adults that might live alone. But surprisingly, even though we have smaller household size and the rise of single households, globally, we see an increase in household size. This is quite a quandary for many of us. Why aren't we seeing static household size or declining household size? So if we combine some of these statistics and model what might happen in the future, we see that we're going to build a lot more urban areas, we're going to transform a lot of land. Depending on how you look at it, it's either a good news or a bad news. Somewhere between 40 to 60% of the projected new urban areas in 2050 have yet to be built today. In other words, there's a huge opportunity going into the future. But again, we have to widen our lens and our aperture beyond just thinking about cities and understand how they operate in their larger environment. Here's an image of Las Vegas in 1976 and Lake Mead to the east. I'm going to fast forward to 2015, and you'll see that Las Vegas will have tripled in size, and Lake Mead will have shrunk by about a third. This is happening all around the world. So again, we need to think about how we build future cities at scale. But it's not only the land use change and carbon emissions. We know that future urban expansion could drive significant habitat loss and conversion. Some of the work that we've done in my lab show that future urban expansion going out to 2050 is going to lead to habitat loss for more than 10,000 species of just terrestrial invertebrates. We didn't look at other species, just terrestrial invertebrates. And it's not just biodiversity, it's also farmland. All around the world, urbanization and urban expansion is taking place on prime agricultural land, whether it's in China or in Canada or in Egypt. And layer on top of the loss of agricultural land, the stress of farm production and yields due to increasing temperatures and droughts as well. Farmland loss is going to be acute in certain parts of the world. In Egypt, we forecast that the country will lose about a third of its most productive farmland. China will lose about 5%, Nigeria will lose about 5%. So again, this is just due to urban expansion. Doesn't even factor in the loss of harvests due to climate change. We also know that future urban expansion could increase local temperatures, and in some places up to 5.6 degrees C. And I want to emphasize that this urban-induced warming, it could exceed warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, how we build our cities and the materials that we use to build our cities, the layout of urban form, could increase local temperatures more than global climate change. And this is especially the case in Global South, the areas that I have highlighted here. I do want to end on an optimist note, though, and that is that the international policymakers and international discussions have really focused a lot more recently on cities as potential solutions for climate change. When I first got involved as an IPCC author more than 10 years ago, when we presented the final report in Berlin, this is in 10 years ago, 2014, when we presented our report, countries around the world weren't sure what the role of cities were in mitigating climate change. When we presented our chapter on how cities could mitigate climate change, in fact, policymakers asked us questions about how important could cities be. Aren't they just so small? They occupy such a small area on the landscape. The impression at the international level was that cities just don't matter. We have to think about the energy transition, the big picture. So this is the optimistic note. When I presented our chapter in 2022 for the 6th assessment report during COVID, it was all done by Zoom. It was a very different political landscape. And the questions that countries asked us, instead of asking, do cities matter? The questions were, what can cities do? And what can we do right now? That was the question that I kept being asked. What can cities do right now? And so I turn it to all of you. Now, I'm a scientist. I study the effects of urbanization at scale. And we know that how we design, operate, construct cities in the future will be critical to solving the climate crisis. And I want to just highlight one other opportunity for our collective communities, which is that the IPCC, which is comprised of 105 countries that comprise the UN, the IPCC has a special report that will come out in March 2027, which is a special report on cities and climate change. This is an opportunity to highlight what cities can do and what they must do. And again, I just urge that we need to come up with solutions that can be implemented, not for one city or even one building, but what could be implemented at scale. And here I want to just end with emphasizing that we have this incredible opportunity and challenge. We've done forecasting work in my lab where we've shown that most of the urban areas in the future have yet to be built. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Barbara Reck, who is the Director of Materials at the Bauhaus Earth, and she's also a research scientist at the Center for Industrial Ecology at Yale School of Environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Alan, very much for the invitation. And to you, Alan, and also to Karen for laying out basically the framework of my talk then so well. And so I will talk a little bit about the material side and maybe also say again, so why is our focus on materials? And I will do this using examples from two recent projects. And the first one of those is actually work that I did. I'm also involved with the Remade Institute, which somebody has never heard of here. This is a US manufacturing institute that looks at decreasing embodied emissions in manufacturing. And therefore, they are not looking at construction materials. That's why this hasn't been come up here. But we're looking at metals, at plastics, at fibers, at e-waste. And particularly the metals and also the plastics are quite important here. And but again, the idea is putting the materials that are used in buildings also sort of in context of where else are they being used. The challenge, Alan, well, we've heard it already. Here we have 37% of global CO2 emissions coming from the built environment. Currently, mostly sort of 73% of those coming from operational energy, 10% of sort of embodied energy, but embodied energy to continue to grow in relative proportion because operational energy efficiency measures will continue to really be quite successful. And of these embodied energy, the big chunk of that is really from steel and concrete. Each of these industries alone, sort of across all sectors, they are responsible for some 7% of direct energy-related CO2 emissions. And both of these are also hard to decarbonize, and I have to go back. I realize I talked about the first project. I didn't talk about the second project. I apologize. That is a report that we did in 2023 that was published actually 1.5 years ago that Anna had sort of spearheaded on sort of, well, what are the climatic challenges for building materials and how can we move forward. And I will show just sort of from the material side some of the key conclusions that we have taken here. And in that report, we have also looked in a lot of detail at what are the decarbonization options for cement and steel. and which I'm sort of here just sort of glancing at. And the short story is, well, there is some concrete recycling at end of life, and you sort of, you crush it up, you put it, use it as an aggregate, but really concrete recycling, disassembly is really, it's in its infancy and not really happening. And the problem why this sort of crushing it up and using it as gravel somewhere is not from a CO2 perspective very impactful, because most of the embodied energy comes from the cement. And if the cement ends up in road gravel or road aggregate, the cement will not replace primary new cement, which is really the bulk of the energy. So in the terms of, for cement right now, we don't see hardly any circularity that really also reuses the cement as cement and not something else as a filler. And in the steel industry, there are options there. It's mostly the moment you use recycled material, you're all good, and you can decrease the energy substantially. We don't have enough recycled steel, I'll show that. And if you're using primary materials, where there are some fancy alternatives where based among others on hydrogen, and there you have the competition. Every industry right now needs hydrogen, and there's just not enough access to hydrogen available. So those are two, sort of in a nutshell, sort of the challenges of these materials. This is again showing the main building materials now, and their greenhouse gas emissions from 2020 to 2060. And what we see is the biggest share is concrete, followed by steel and bricks in terms of embodied or greenhouse gas emissions. And then you also have aluminum, and then some other materials playing a very minor role here. And the share, overall, the emissions are going up, but the shares, there's no really, in a business as usual scenario, nothing would change here. And I think here we believe that this has to change, and there will be at the end. So going back, sort of, how do we assess circularity then? If we know, well, circular solutions, they are really making a dent also on recycling. And the way we are doing this in industrial ecology, we are saying, okay, we simplify the world into production of a material, fabrication, manufacturing, use and recycling, or waste management, but we only have the circular material if in the middle you really reuse the scrap that is generated at various life stages and make sure that that replaces primary material. And so here we have the extraction, the fabrication, the use, and the waste management. So that is the very simplified version. After a lot of different sort of projects and research that we can do, we get to also a very high level sort of summary. Here, this would be the global steel cycle in 2017. Where you see sort of a little bit indicated through the arrows with that sort of we are taking a lot of pig iron or iron out of the ground, we are recycling it, or we are sort of processing it and then eventually using it. And then you see at the use phase, you see this sort of, oops, what happens? Where's all the material? Because at end of life, there is much, much, much less. And that is that we are using steel in long-lasting products, on average 20, 25 years. And we are using more every year, so you have this lifetime delay that is really exacerbated by also having this sort of, that we're using more and more every year. So even if you had 100% recycled material available from 20, 30 years ago, it would only cover a fraction of today's demand. That is really in the metal industry in general, the big dilemma. And then you can sort of calculate your some of those metrics. So we see that recycled content is 34%. That means how much in new steel production comes from scrap as opposed to primary materials. And we see the end-of-life recycling rate, meaning how much of that available 450 here really gets recycled. And that is for steel, this is among, or is the highest because it's the easiest to recycle. The moment you go to other metals, it's getting much lower very quickly because there is mixing and there's not enough sortation, and they throw it in doubt, everything goes back to steel. So that's sort of the story here. And this was the high-level view. If you're doing these studies in detail, it looks more like this. So, and we don't need to go through this, but the point is that we are looking at these statistics in as much detail as we can. Very broadly to the left, we have in dark gray, these are would be the primary input material, and in light gray is this, that's then the scrap. But not just end-of-life scrap, but a lot of also processing scrap, which you could say are inefficiencies in processing in the first place. And then you're using them in all kind of materials. And I highlighted here the building sector is here. This was for the US. In the US, it's maybe a quarter of use of the steel goes for buildings. But at the global level, we are using more like a third, because in the US, more steel goes into cars, but cars are not used as much in other countries of the world as in the US. That's sort of the explanation. And you can do this material by material. We have here the same thing for aluminum. And here, just to illustrate, these cycles look very different material by material, because the processing and the whole usage, everything is different. And you have to go with available data availability. But in the end, we can use, again, and we can aggregate the information to global cycles. And for aluminum, which again looks somewhat different. And we have an end-of-life cycling rate that's already down to 63%. So recycling options are limited. And so again, a recap of those conventional materials: cement and steel, carbon intensive to produce. Cement, there's basically no recycling. Steel and aluminum are okay, but only can cover a relatively small amount of the total demand because of long lifetimes, and we are using so much of the material. So then, okay, what's next? And one is also to say, well, historically, how have we been using materials? And this is from a group in Vienna. They're always looking at all materials, including also biomaterials, and they're looking at economy-wide flows. So they're not at the substance level, what we are doing, but really sort of just for anything. And here what we see is sort of in green, we have biogenic flows, and in blue, we have metals and minerals, and then fossil. And so in 1945, it was mostly sort of biomass, etc., so in green, but by 2015, this has completely changed. And so first we see how much more materials we're using. Another visualization, what Alan showed earlier on, and the metals and minerals really overtaking. And then we're going back to the UNEP report with Anna, and there really we said, okay, we think, given this and lots of other studies that we did, a sustainable future needs to change this ratio of bio-based versus non-bio-based, and we have to go back using less of the non-renewable materials and increasing use of bio-based materials, and also what is here the sort of in the middle, that part, we need to use lots more recycled materials. So circularity, which we will talk about this afternoon, is really, really important on all this. So what we said is that then we sort of looked at the absolute numbers. This was from existing research, and again, currently in the built environment, most material being used from concrete, and then we have, and this is now, these are not greenhouse gas emissions, this is really mass of materials, and steel then, and then the bio-based relatively low. And what we see is, again, in those sort of dashed lines here, that steel, we have a big chunk of secondary material. We basically have none in concrete, and we have a little bit for the other materials, but not much. And our vision was to say then, okay, this would be the more sustainable solution, a general shift to bio-based and a general shift to lots more reused materials, and particularly for concrete stuff that actually Phil may mention it, but there is this reuse of concrete, etc., which really would help, and that's it. And so going back to the original cycle, this would be sort of the bio-based material cycle that we'd like. Thank you.
Next, we welcome somebody who needs no introduction in this room, our Deputy Dean, Philip Bernstein, and also Professor Adjunct at the School of Arts, and sure, formerly the Vice President of Autodesk in charge of the Building Information Modeling Strategy.
Thanks, Anna. I'm a big fan of Alan and Barbara and Anna and Karen's work because we all work on a question I think is really interesting, which is architects operate in certain kinds of systems, and we don't understand those systems very well. We operate in project delivery systems, material systems, and labor systems, and we don't have a great degree of insight into that problem. And I've been doing some work with a team over the last couple of years that includes folks from the University of Michigan, Kieran Timberlake, Bureau Happold, and here at Yale. And we've been looking at this question of what we call supply chain equity, which is a little bit orthogonal to the conversations that we've had up to this point, but is an important system and system of flows that really affects this question of how we get to regenerative building. And so I want to give a re-presentation today based on one that Billy and I gave a couple of months ago that was in a lot more detail, that really it asks the question of where are the humans in these delivery systems that we work on. We've been teaching a course here at Yale jointly with the University of Michigan for the last couple of years addressing the question of modern slavery in the building supply chain. And really, labor equity in the supply chain is a very similar problem to the ones that we're going to be discussing during the next couple of days. My aspiration, however, is to get to the point where I have charts and graphs that are as cool as the charts and graphs that you guys have seen up to this point, but we're not there yet. So, as architects, we tend to think of this problem as labor abuse on construction sites. This was from the Architects newspaper with the Saudi Nome project recently. Then there was Mabel Wilson's work from 2014 called Who Builds Your Architecture, where Mabel and her team from Columbia mapped the flows of construction workers relative to the flows of design information that come from architects. And what we know is the supply chains that architects live at the front of include enormous sequences of labor abuse of which we are largely completely unaware. And the challenges of our relationship to those supply chains is very similar to the understanding the relationships that Alan and everybody here at the symposium are going to be talking about. So the first question is, what is this thing? We're still trying to get our arms around the question of what the definition of forced labor is and where does it happen in the construction supply chain. And it's not simply on the construction site. And some of our work has begun to appreciate the fact that there are these whole systems of folks working under various kinds of conditions that are a kind of subtext to the overall building supply chain and the building materials chain. And really what we're trying to figure out in our research right now is how do we figure these supply chains out from a labor perspective? And how do we define equity in those supply chains where folks are simply not being forced to work on things that are related to the building supply chain? So the definition we've been working from is the following, that forced labor is all work or service which is extracted from any person under the menace or any penalty for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. And so these systems that we as architects leverage contain enormous amounts of this kind of labor inequity, but we really don't understand them very well at all. So our team's been working a little bit along with a lot of other folks that are working on global supply chain equity to define forced labor or modern slavery. And it's really about how people are moved around in the system, what they're forced to do, and what sorts of other dimensions there are that drive the way people are forced to behave in these systems of supply. And there should be some very familiar themes from the discussion we've had this morning about what the things are that drive forced labor in the supply chain. Climate change is a huge one, driving the labor force around, conflicts and war, natural disasters, a lot of them caused by climate change. And then, of course, there's a large gender inequality question in this equation as well. And it's hard to get your finger precisely on the numbers of folks in the world that are actually in forced labor conditions, but a couple of organizations have published reports, including the ILO, suggesting that that number is about 27 or 28 million people, and approximately 20 million of those folks are associated in some form with things in the building industry: extraction, transportation, manufacturing, on-site construction, which is a pretty large number of people. It's far more than 20 times as many architects as there are in the world. And this is some statistics also from the ILO that show you where our problem is. Our problem is somewhere in the intersection between manufacturing and construction. It's not entirely clear how you define those things, but the supply chains and the economic flows that are related to forced labor encompass the entire planet. These are valuations of materials related to folks who have been exploited from a labor perspective in the overall supply chain. Now, interestingly, my teaching colleague on this project has been a gentleman named Lou DeBaca. Lou is a former U.S. ambassador. He teaches at University of Michigan now. He started the forced labor unit at the State Department under the Obama administration. And Lou wrote a federal regulation that makes it illegal to bring any material made by forced labor into the United States. The question is, how do you stop it? This is a graph that shows you where this stuff is coming from and the number of interdictions that have occurred, and it's extremely limited because our understanding of the system, of the circular system, is extremely limited, very, very constricted, and the number of interdictions has been quite low, and I suspect it's going to get even lower. And so when we were trying to teach this question to our students, one day in the first year I was teaching this course, I asked Lou, don't think about this problem. Pick the material that you think is most problematic from a forced labor perspective in the building industry. And he said, it's easy, zinc. And I thought, uh-oh, this is a building you're sitting in right now, largely encased in manufactured zinc. And so we built this diagram for our students that essentially described how Charlie Gwathmey, when he made his sketch of the building you're sitting in right now, which is up on the left, that set of ideas flowed through a whole complex system of decision-making, risk allocation, profit objectives, and other kinds of motivations, and ultimately led to the enslavement of this child that you see in this Peruvian zinc oxide mine. And you can see here, don't try to read this chart because we can't even read it, but all these players through the entire process involved in all these different kinds of transactions. And in fact, architects themselves are really, really far away from this problem. These are some diagrams that Billy's team at Kieran Timberlake put together. This is one of those don't try to read the diagram, Barbara, thing. This is a flowchart that Kieran Timberlake put together just explaining the labor flows that originate with decisions made in that black box up there. That's us. And these are all the different kinds of relationships. And the problem, of course, is that we as architects make our systems decisions based on how projects are structured. Who's the contractor? Who's the subcontractor? Who are the engineers? When you try to bring the labor question into this equation, it gets extremely complicated. I'm going to skip through some of these, but the other question that got raised very interestingly in our profession was when Martin Filler wrote an article, which he subsequently, by the way, had to retract in the New Republic, asking Zaha Hadid what she thought about forced labor on her construction site. She said, I have nothing to do with the workers. I think that's an issue for the government. If there's a problem, the government should pick it up. Hopefully these things will be resolved. It is not my duty as an architect to look at it. I cannot do anything about it because I have no power to do anything about it. Now that's perhaps a misstatement of the facts in that particular situation, but I think it does synopsize in some form the attitude that many architects have about this particular problem. So the question is, what as an industry, what do we do about this? What's our actual approach to this problem? And it's really kind of an intractable one. But the way I think Billy describes this really, really well has to do with supply chain distance and perception, that we somehow live on the right-hand side of this diagram and that the industry itself lives on the left-hand side of this diagram, and we're going to have to find a way to connect those things. And so the thing that's interesting about this problem is it has a direct relationship to the thinking we believe around climate change. We think that certain kinds of analytical strategies and disciplinary approaches around life cycle thinking or possibly embodied carbon modeling might be applicable in this situation if we can sort of figure out sort of a relationship between technological questions and sociological questions. Where do the kind of human rights standards overlap with the sorts of things, the sorts of instruments that the industry can apply as sort of technical solutions? And, kind of what sorts of things could actually happen? And there are a lot of framework reports out there. There are lots of strategies that have been attempted to calculate labor exploitation. Our team put together a project to try to look at whether we could model this. Could we create a strategy based on embodied carbon where we could somehow model embodied suffering? And I'll save you the trouble. The experiment was a complete failure. We felt like we worked for a year and a half trying to figure this out. The system actually failed. And we concluded ultimately that a purely technological solution, a modeling solution, was actually unlikely to solve any problems. And it actually created more problems than it identified. This is what our team calls the risk of identifying risk. When you identify a labor problem at the end of the supply chain, you may eliminate it, but the people who are no longer enslaved are now starving. And so what are the secondary implications of this, and how do you attack the problem? So I'm going to skip to the end of this. So when that experiment failed, what we kind of decided was a couple of things. Number one, maybe the answer, despite my own inclinations, was not technical. This wasn't a tools problem, wasn't a data problem, wasn't a database problem, that we actually needed to understand these flows, these kinds of flows, in a different kind of way, and redefine the building supply chain, the delivery model, from the design firm's perspective in a different kind of way. This is the way, in my classroom, I describe the building delivery structure from the architect's perspective. You've got your client, you've got your contractor, your subcontractors, but in fact, this problem is really defined by this. There are tiers of workers involved, and the architects need to find ways to see through the system to understand the relationship between these pieces. And so that's sort of what we've been trying to work on, and what we're going to try to do going forward in abandoning some of these technological solutions is to try to look at the problem from the opposite direction, look at it from a sort of a worker-led approach. And I think that's to some degree analogous to to some of the work that we were just seeing about trying to understand where the carbon is. But we need to figure out, in a way, starting from the back end of the supply chain, where these problems are and try to work them forward from there. So with that, I will turn it over to Phil. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. So we have another Philip Misowitz, who is the CEO of the Bauhaus Earth and chair of the Habitat Unit at the Technical University.
Thank you very much for letting me be the outsider here on this really exciting panel. I have to say I volunteered for being the last speaker, but I realize now that maybe this wasn't a very strategic choice, because now I'm being introduced as an architect planner with boots on the ground. Anna, I sense the fear of carrying the burden of now presenting solutions. And the projects that I will present will not hold that pressure. They are small projects, they are first steps, maybe representing ways of thinking and doing on the ground, but I think it's really for the entire conference and people in the room to answer the challenge that you set, Karen, in your amazing presentation. So just really short introductory words about what Bauhaus Earth is. It's a fairly young organization, just 3.5 years old. The idea came from the climate scientist John Schellnhuber, and there are several people in the room that have really helped to get this going. One is Alan Organsky, who took quite a considerable amount of time away from Yale and his office to come over to Berlin, where we are based, to set up this group that has now grown to more than 50 people. And we work in a sort of organizational design that is supposed to really respond to the problems, the systemic issues that were laid out here in this panel, working from systems transformation research, data analytics, towards technical and material innovation, demonstration, application, really bringing this into an architectural scale to also being part of policy and action advisories and education and learning programs. We also work in a really networked way, and there are many people that are part of our new Relab network that are also in the room, like Matti Kurtinen and Dani Ibanez and others, and we are really hoping also to extend this. Boots on the ground means working in networks, working with really exciting people that are embedded in different environments, different geographies, that we need to network, particularly in these challenging political times. So I'm going to do a bit of ground truthing for you, referring to a project that is called Rebuild, that is funded by the German government, that takes us to these locations in really exciting local partner setups, to Berlin-Brandenburg, Paru, Thimphu in Bhutan, Denpasar, Indonesia, and Cape Town in South Africa. And I'm presenting a sort of some sets of thinking and a kind of knowledge that I think really is complementing the kind of exciting studies that were presented here in the panel. The need to link policy and science on a system level, global system level, to really place-based contextual conditions, and to seize also the momentum of frontrunners and innovators. Sometimes they come from architecture, sometimes they come from completely different fields that are often struggling to get resources, to get support. They have many ideas, but they fail and struggle to be scaled because of a lack of resources. And I think we, despite all the cuts and the craziness happening in the science funding world right now, we still are close to the trough. We have the resources, so we need to make sure that we channel them to areas and support innovators that work elsewhere. So these are the geographies I want to quickly introduce. Bhutan, Berlin-Brandenburg, Denpasar, Cape Town. There is actually also global studies on material demand and supply that is part of the study. I will not talk about that. So I will talk about these deep dives. In each case, they represent an urbanizing region embedded in a broader kind of ecosphere where we try to kind of think systemically how, in that particular context, with the particular climate challenges and social challenges that we face, we could construct nature-based material pathways towards regenerative urban rural regions, which we call bioregions. The first one, Bhutan, our entry there was made possible by people also in the room like Jonathan Roth, who have worked with the king and his administration in Bhutan to pave the way for a very ambitious program, a government-led program, to turn a country maybe into the first climate negative country, including the building economy. And Alan has been deeply involved in this work in Bhutan. Just to introduce you to what it is like to be in Bhutan with the eyes of this photographer, Bas Princeton, who's been there for us as part of the research project. There are many forest practices that remind you of ancient practices of hunting. So people from local communities tapping into community forest, just cutting out what they need, log by log, in the forest, and putting it to use. And that knowledge exists also in the rural parts. It exists in renovating amazing historic monuments. It is often also combined with a still alive culture of rammed earth construction, bamboo construction, but it is lost when it comes to the urbanizing valleys. This is Paru Thimphu, the capital region of Bhutan, where suddenly these material practices completely change. They're actually not in control of local craftsmen and local contractors, but mainly by imported labor, imported materials trucked up from India, for instance, the narrow valleys to the more than 2,000 meter high Paru Thimphu. and then being applied here using migrant labor, imported materials, etc., etc. So there was a very exciting process going on involving Arabs and private partners by the Commission of the government to do a structural plan for the capital region. We were able to benefit from the amazing sort of material demand analysis that came with that, assessing what future demand exists in this kind of valley and putting in contrast an ongoing assessment of what source landscapes exist in Bhutan that may feed the material demand for this urbanization as alternatives to the imported steel and concrete. So we looked in particular at timber, but also at hemp and bamboo. Bhutan is an amazing country that has in the past issued legislation completely protecting 70% of the land coverage in Bhutan, which is forest. So reducing the amount of loggable and manageable forest to a minimum. But even based on that, we are able to show in the project how through optimization of value chains, through better forest management practices, actually there is a real potential in building product value chains that include those kind of 4 lead materials. I start with hemp though, because this is something still not very much talked about, using here a diagram from the Healthy Materials Lab in New York. But we conducted our own experiments with hemp and a possible application of hemp as a complementary material to timber, assessing, for instance, the possibility to use earth as a binder for these hemp. This is ongoing. But coming back to wood, one of the major problems is actually the losses, the inefficiencies, and also the lacks of capacities and knowledge along the value chain of timber, which is a result of outsourcing basically construction activity for decades. Using here some work from Gray-Organsky architects that also joined this team of researchers and consultants, and looking at what these limited forest management units where productive forestry is allowed, what they could yield and how they could feed a demand. And then what would happen, identifying the intervention points along the entire value chain of timber, from ecological silvicultural practices and regenerative forest management that needs to be honored and also more reinforced, to promoting low impact harvesting and also forest worker health and safety, to strategically sited timber processing and lumber distribution facilities, rural employment and enterprise opportunity, to product development, material testing, quality assurance, and then optimizing manufacturing, storage, handling, grading, sorting, primary waste reduction, recovery, etc. And using, and this is where Gray-Organsky architects and Arabs have developed a business model for an industrial timber value chain, actually high technology, digitized production, offsite manufacturing, to use the material that is available in best possible ways to apply it to urban uses. And this is a pilot that hopefully will be realized soon by Gray-Organsky architect and Arab, looking at the kind of dense urban typologies that are required to house people, to meet the demand for housing in these kind of growing valleys of Bhutan, entirely constructed from bio-based, regionally sourced timber. We have set up a kind of Regenerative Bhutan lab, which is a site, a place for workshops, for exhibits, for interacting with local government representatives, but also NGOs, students, etc. That is key, and are developing now an update of a first roadmap that Bauhaus Earth, Arab, and the Climate Smart Forest Economy Program jointly co-authored, that answers in complex ways the systemic innovation needs to make really this transition possible. So change mindsets and perceptions about timber and bio-based construction, forge a strong network of partners to ensure cross-agency and transdisciplinary collaboration, identify and implement pragmatic steps along the transformation pathways, create an enabling environment that demonstrates the value and practicality of bio-based materials, establish and enforce critical forest safeguards, catalyze private sector enterprise, upskill the Bhutanese workforce, and also think about how this innovation could benefit the entire region of the Himalayas. I take you to the second site. Before coming back for a summary, I come back to Bhutan briefly later, to Denpasar in Bali, where the forests are mainly bamboo forests, degraded bamboo forests. There has been quite a lot of innovation for forest restoration, but the material that is yielded from that enters global packaging industry value chains and not the local building economy, which is still based on extractive materials, concrete and steel. Completely separate worlds, as it were. And our work there also was about understanding the systems, the systemic challenges, understanding material availability, natural resources, construction sector practices, what the construction sector could actually carry and deliver, and where are opportunities and also challenges for material transitions there, but also looking at social spatial dynamics, policy regulation barriers, and also key actors that could really lead a system change. Again, we found it absolutely necessary to work also very concretely with specific material sets, understand along the entire value chain, and also build and pilot buildings that could be smelled and touched and looked at, and ultimately do much more convincing work than reports can do. And I'll talk about that in a second. And this will lead to a broader policy document, which we call a roadmap. So understanding the opportunities of bamboo means understanding also the existing value chains, and also find ways of discussing a gentle kind of industrialization to create more efficiency, optimize the material intake, and also end up with technical solutions around, for instance, cross-laminated bamboo and bamboo plywood that would actually be more suitable for industrial and also urban housing solutions. And this is what we did with RFRB, our local partner, a demonstrator building that draws kind of references from traditional Balinese architecture, the Bale Banjars, using some of these kind of material innovations that were jointly developed. It will open next week and looked a few weeks like this. That shows how it can be done, and does a lot of kind of on the ground kind of convincing work and change of perception work. But then, of course, we need to play it back into the system, think about scaling. And we are right now sort of working on adopting an Indonesian national standard for engineered bamboo products, and also having conversation with the national government that has a bamboo action plan and is willing to build a third, i.e. 1 million homes across Indonesia from bamboo for a social housing program. And we see what amazing kind of reductions we can achieve when we use these kind of locally resourced materials. Final site, before I come to an end, is Berlin-Brandenburg, where we are based. It's a complex story, but again, it is a kind of dysfunctional system that requires careful analysis and repair. So we have, for instance, it's a post-war legacy, the largest kind of concentration of pine plantations around Berlin that replaced beech and oak forests that were destroyed in the war or became reparation wood and shipped off to Russia. So this is what East Germany could afford. And now these are ecosystems that are under heavy climate pressures. They are burning, there is beetle infection, they need replacement. We have a stock that could potentially house 20 million people, But because of regulatory barriers and, quite frankly, a dirty timber industry, 80% of that stuff gets exported to Australia or China or even Canada. At the same time, we have a building economy that is extremely wasteful. We're losing buildings because demolitions are not regulated on a daily basis, mainly from the 50s and 60s. A lot of carbon is wasted and then replaced by conventional building practices. We are also experiencing maybe a milder form of populist kind of backlashes against any climate transition or green construction arguments. We have also a kind of urban-rural divide around Berlin, a disenfranchised kind of urban population, rural population that tends to vote for the far right. We have an election coming up next week. We have climate transitions and sustainable architecture like a hot potato, not wanting to be touched by any of the parties. So what do we do? Again, small steps, showing what is possible on the ground. We realized we did systems analysis with partners there. We looked deeply into available forests. We looked into what the restoration, the climate proofing of the forest system around Brandenburg would require, what kind of investment, what kind of species. But we also want to show how it can be done and look at and combine these kind of material streams that are locally sourced from trees, rare species, also from construction waste or recycling, put them together into small kind of touchable, smellable kind of sites and places which are then used for education campaigns, for workshops, etc., and demonstrate as sort of live exhibits how a radical kind of regional regenerative architecture might look and feel like. So coming back to some kind of concluding thinking, what is it systems thinking that we all advocate? What does it mean when you have boots on the ground? Of course, we still need to understand where the carbon is. We need to get that, what Alan explained, what everybody talked about, where the carbon in the building cycle is. I have a kind of life cycle perspective, understanding where material comes from, how we end waste and reduce and optimize our building product value chain. But we also spot really the key opportunity here in thinking more broadly away from a sort of city-centric approach towards a more regional approach, where we really need to understand, and this is also a planning question, this is a land use question, this is a governance question, the kind of entanglements that we want to drive back to and draw on between natural resource landscapes that might provide bio-based materials and cities. And creating a sort of synergetic co-repair, as we sometimes call it, through regionally sourced nature-based construction materials, ensuring the value increase upstream in the biosphere, because this is where it could generate money that is necessary and is lacking to actually restore the forest or re-wet peatlands, and downstream through regenerative construction in cities. And we also need to think across different scales. It's not enough to think simply about materials or product value chains. We need to think about cities and neighborhoods. We need to think about bioregions and continued global entanglements. And to add another layer of complexity, we need to acknowledge that we have multiple entry points into these kind of system change pathways, responding to local political priorities and feelings. So, for instance, in Bhutan, we have a very strong motivation of the government to provide jobs for a youth population between the age of 17 and 25 that to 70% has left the country to seek jobs in Australia. So we need to have well-paid jobs in the construction industry. It's one of the main motivations. Bhutan is also very proud of the ecosystem stewardship that should not be challenged. And it's a very strong government-led kind of process, completely different from, for instance, Bali, where the government came only into the picture much later. There's much more motivation around local building cultures and lifestyles. We were able to show how the traditional Badiban jar can serve as a kind of model, an entry point for demonstrating alternative architectural solutions. There's also an economic motivation and a very strong subsidiarity, very, very strong, proud kind of local governance structures. In Western Cape, we could not get a seat on the table or a door open to us when we talked about climate transitions. We had to talk about entrenched social-spatial inequalities and youth unemployment and poverty, and what sort of opportunities we could harvest through this transition for a more distributive economy, for low-skilled jobs, for income generation. We have to acknowledge there the sort of dark material histories, how we were told my grandmother lived her entire life in a township, and now you want her not to have that concrete and brick house. And also there's huge amounts of economic incentives. And in Berlin, the situation is yet again different. We face over-regulations, we face a lot of myth against timber or bio-based materials, an increasing cost of living crisis, a housing crisis that immediately considers any kind of material discussions luxury, nice to have but not essential. So with these thoughts, I'll leave you, and I really hope that everybody else in the room that will talk after this panel will enrich the discussion about solutions. Thank you very much.
I would just announce that actually folks can write down questions, and we will start to field questions shortly. So, in the spirit of drawing across scales, the first question that I have actually is addressed to both Karen and Philip. We saw in Karen's data that economies in the global south, although they've had a very historically a very small proportion of contributions to climate change effects previously, will undoubtedly comprise the bulk of the building material boom that is ongoing and growing. And so when we look at, for example, this extraordinary alignment of stakeholders that you showed, for example, in Bhutan or in Bali, in comparison, many folks in this room will have had or will have the experience of working with international clients and communities in other regions where there's a very, very strong association, and sometimes intractably strong association of progress and modernity with high carbon materials such as concrete, steel, and glass. And maybe when we bring that, to a kind of global perspective, as coordinating author of 2 global IPCC reports, I would imagine that you've had a lot of discussions in Global South where, in a parallel sense, in a very large sense, the question is, why shouldn't we have the right to develop in the way that the Global North has developed? So what would be your response to these things? Presumably you've come into contact with this discourse. How do we broach this kind of discussion, both at that global and hyper-local scale?
Well, I continue where I left it. I think that the question is critical, how to make these materials aspirational materials and overcome their kind of association with rurality, backwardness, kind of the past, and how do we make the kind of the middle class kind of family investing in their home in the next 15 years, one of the 2 billion that we know, how do we make them to make that choice? And this is a really difficult question to answer, of course, but there are, I think I can only answer it by simply saying we need a lot of piloting. We need a lot of stuff that you can watch and touch and see, together with all the other support that make it economically viable, the choice of those materials, even an advantage. that people understand that it creates local employment, it creates also a much more healthy and conducive house. I mean, we have some of our colleagues work in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where it was very aspirational to have a concrete house in your yard, but at the extreme temperatures, seasonal temperatures, people move out into their old clay hut and they fight over it. Who can sleep in the clay hut? Because earth and clay has a much better capacity to take off the peaks of temperatures. It stores energy at night and it absorbs heat in the day. So these very practical kind of everyday advantages that come with a lot of these biomaterial solutions should be foreground. I think should lead the narrative that we need to construct. I think if we come with global responsibility and sorry, you're too late, you can't reach into the carbon pool now, we're lost. I mean, that's considered to be kind of neo-colonial for quite justifiable reasons. So we need to be cleverer than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say there are 2 points. I mean, one is that for much of the global south, the issue of urbanization is around how do they increase the infrastructure that they have, right? It's not about reducing the infrastructure. They're already at such low levels. So how do we increase the municipal services, the infrastructure, and at the same time build in a much more low carbon way? So that's clearly one issue. The other is that we absolutely need to lead by example. And that's critical for the global north, is that to show that we can rebuild or we can build new by design. This cannot be something that's bespoke only for these niche places. Again, I just want to emphasize that it has to be done at scale. And so how can this be made affordable to many different peoples, different economies, and very different contexts?
Yeah. If I could add one thought. I mean, a lot of the reason why steel and concrete in African states, for instance, is so cheap is because there's a really predatory global economy that pushes this material into these countries. It's not being locally produced. Kenya, Ethiopia, there's hardly any concrete or steel production in these countries, but they build everything from this material. So there's something disturbingly wrong with global value chains in countries like Rwanda, who have actually introduced an import tax to building materials. And I know import tax is a difficult topic to talk about right now, but it led to local innovation because it's suddenly more expensive to actually purchase a complete window frame manufactured somewhere in Europe, and people draw and reinvent kind of local solutions.
That's a great silver lining that you've just mentioned about cross-border adjustment mechanisms and other things. I would say also, just to point out, that Bhutan, although a very small country, maybe is an incredible example because of its scale of demonstrating a scale-up of a kind of circular material economy that is deeply related to the region and to all of the different actors that have to make decisions, which is just very, very difficult to do in maybe to start out with in maybe larger countries. So that was a really extraordinary alignment. And speaking of predatory material producers and economies, I'd like to address that question to you, Barbara, because a lot of people don't know that last diagram that you presented led to a tremendous degree of bullying, international bullying and intimidation. We were actually forced not to show it by the concrete lobby at COP29 and also at the meeting in Paris. We managed first to show it at the World Circularity Forum, Barbara and I, but after that it kind of got shut down a little bit. But we did have, in a way, a vindication that others chose that diagram. Unbeknownst to Arup, which is the largest engineering firm in the world for certain types of research, those of you that don't know it, in their keynote in Paris, they chose our diagram, that diagram that you chose, as the path forward. We were very surprised that they didn't choose their own diagram because they had made a global report as well on materials. But they weren't aware of the controversy that we had been suffering from this. And so on that note, I want to ask you, Barbara, as a scientist especially, can you talk a little bit about this power of visualization and also the messiness of diagrams like that in comparison? Because you showed a lot of very highly quantified diagrams where we can have a great degree of reliability in the projections and in the information, as opposed to these future projections. Just about the role of visualization, and then that could also be a twinned question with Phil, although I have another question for you, Phil, but I just think the visualizations in both of your presentations were so deeply compelling and instructive. And there was kind of an aha moment, I don't know for others, but for me, when I was seeing a lot of Phil's diagrams, seeing information that you know represented very differently in terms of its role as a paradigm shift, but also as a point of provocation and dissent.
Maybe thank you, Anna. I think the first thing really, I think, to remember is to provide context that is sufficient. And I think that diagram, the big misunderstanding that happened, it was a relative diagram. It was that relatively we should really switch from going 80% non-renewables, 20% to at least sort of a 50-50 share with bio-based or low carbon materials. But that was relative. And as we know from Karen's presentation, the absolute demand for building materials will continue to grow quite a bit. So maybe in this respect, I think maybe some people overreacted in the sense they thought, oh, we want to take their market share and we are going out of business. No, not at all. Because in a growing business, even if the relative share sort of decreases quite a bit, the absolute values probably don't change a bit. So there will be continuously a lot of demand for concrete. And so I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think the construction, to me as an outsider, the construction industry is one of those sort of big animals that move slowly. Right now, no concrete recycling or no hardly any reuse. That is something I think in general all industries, not just the construction industries, everybody has to move to circularity. We talk about it more, and it's happening. And yes, it's complicated. It's a messy business, but it's possible. And all this messiness creates opportunities. Like 20 years ago, nobody thought that solar and wind would be where it is today, and all of a sudden, well, there's a lot of jobs were created with it. There was a lot of economic wealth that was created with it. And the same will happen when you change the concrete industry from more primary to secondary. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. So there's a lot about framing. And also with Bowers, we don't see this at all as a controversial diagram. It's a vision. We never said this is what will happen. It's a vision.
That's right.
And so I would
sort
of slow down the temperature.
That's a great segue, actually, because at the very beginning of your presentation, Phil, you started off with the solar panels that we all think are very environmental and yet are probably one of the most at risk in the world for forced labor and unfair labor. Can you talk a little bit about this issue of visualization? And then a quick second question is there a possibility, given the tremendous complexity in tracking all of these materials, both for labor and for environmental conditions, is there any possibility for some reduction in the complexity from the standpoint of recipient specifiers such as designers and builders in getting these worlds together in terms of regulation and certification, or is this do you see that on the horizon?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think that diagram that Billy's team, when she was at Karen Timberlake, built, nobody can understand that thing except for them, right? But if we did an overlay on that and we said, this is kind of to your comment, Barbara, we did an overlay on that and we said, okay, here are the flows of risk and money in this diagram, because that's what drives the building industry, and that's what drives systemic innovation in the building industry. Shifts in risk allocation, and compensation, margin, right? And if we took that diagram and overlaid it with that might be a strategy for simplifying it, because you could find out where the actual inflection points are. And when we started working on this problem a couple of years ago, we took a very architectural-centric view of it. It's like, oh yeah, we'll just map this thing from my decision to build a steel building all the way to this enslaved charcoal farm worker in Brazil. And once I understand that, I can clearly solve it. But when we actually did the map, we were 12 degrees of separation away from that person. And there was so much diffusion of responsibility that the certification, it's impossible to do a certification chain like that. So our more recent thinking is a little bit flipped. It's like we have to actually start at the other end of the diagram and start talking to the workers and figuring out how the workers can help us work backwards through the chain. But this question, at least when we're talking about systemic innovation in the building industry, examples are great, but I take it from my experience when we did a sort of technology disruption. It's really, really slow, and it's really hard to drive systemic change from the bottom up. It has to be top down. And so almost everything that we're talking about here is frankly, a government policy dimension, which I think is a very unpopular point of view. But in our industry, given how diffuse it is, that's where things happen, in my opinion.
Which might lead us to where our influence is. Is it in the building codes? Is it, how do we press back, up towards the chain of policy?
Can I just jump in here? Because I think this is an opportunity for architects and designers to infuse and inform international policy.
Yep.
And I think that these kinds of conversations are so urgently needed, but also that policymakers don't know what they don't know, right? And I think that it's a matter of elevating these case studies to elevating them to a different scale, understanding what the challenges are, and how, again, they could be scaled up.
And getting those figures, the scale-up figures of the what if we were to build or regulate in
Right, but remember, what we do as architects is we turn huge piles of money into buildings, right? We help people turn huge piles of money into built things. And there's a policy dimension to that, but there's also a certain kind of economic dynamic. So in our course, Lou and I, this has happened 4 years in a row. In our course, after the first 2 or 3 weeks of setting up the problem, our students consistently go into this thing we call the valley of despair, right? And they spend 2 weeks really upset about the whole problem. And then this happens every year. They have an epiphany. The solution to the problem is the destruction of global capitalism. That's the solution, right? And we're like, okay, that's a really interesting idea. That might be the subject of a different course, but for now, what can we do right now?
Yeah.
I feel like after that provocation, we must open up to the floor. Questions from the floor? Questions or
Are
comments?
people doing it through the app?
Oh, I'm going to ask them. Okay. There's one question here now from Seth Embry, and it says, I think it's fascinating that you focus on non-visual aspects of potential novel value propositions, smell and touch in particular. Have there, oh my goodness, you're going to have to help me figure. It's going off. Can you just, sorry.
Seth asks, have there been attempts to measure the possibility of these alternatives and undervalue sensorial attributes in affecting adoption of bio-based materials?
Okay, thank you.
You're looking at me?
Yeah, I think we are.
I wasn't focusing on the question. Can you repeat, please?
Seth is fascinated by the idea of emphasizing other value propositions of bio-based materials, specifically sensory ones. You mentioned smell, touch, sight, ways people interact with the built environment. Have you been able to measure those impacts on the value proposition of biomaterials at all?
I mean, this wasn't a focus have to admit, in our work, but there is tremendous amount of research done on that. From kind of comfort level, health perspectives, etc. It is, I would say, a proven case. And the irony is that, we're talking about climate change, responding to climate change. I mean, climate change itself is exacerbating the temperatures that people endure in climates. And exactly the solution also provides the best possible, the cheapest, the most passive, kind of low impact kind of way to mitigate and to survive, to survive extreme heat, extreme cold. So through very simple, kind of often ancient techniques that were developed over millennia in arid climates, we all know that stuff.
Okay, do you want to read the second question?
I think significantly though, does this require a different kind of quantification?
Why don't you just read the question?
We're looking at things like touch and smell that are not typically associated with sort of architecture and visualization. Have to be able to very sort of in-house
Service into the
Okay.
Not deeply and consistently enough, but it's a really interesting proposition. I mean, I think there's fantastic research out there. I think that provides the starting points, the tools, and methods for that. It's often, I mean, we are constructing these pilots, and we are planning to stay with them and see how they perform socially, but also environmentally, technically. Of course, as kind of learning sites. So I think it would be interesting to develop a methodology how much smell actually impacts people's material choices in some way. I'm sure we can learn from food and fashion and other kind of faster, more innovative product value chains. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. There's, I'm sure, many more questions, but we are out of time. So please bring the questions to the breakout. We're going to have some refreshments. And thank you so much to our panel.